Well, if we look at Carr's argument here in the first part of the book, he's obviously setting things up in a similar way, and many of this material, for what it's worth, is very reminiscent of what Postman was doing in Amusing Ourselves to Death. And that is to make an argument that the mind is changing, that the human mind is changing in a certain way as a result of its different way of retrieving and assimilating information. And like Postman in the sections on typographic America and his sections on what American culture was like when print was the dominant medium, setting up an argument that things have changed or are changing. So a lot of this, I have to say, material is going over ground that Postman went over in his different way and probably better way. But again, the real, I would say, difference or what's original or different about Carr's argument is this biological or neurological aspect to it, this very central concept of neuroplasticity and the way that he's making an argument that we're actually rewiring ourselves, or one may say wiring ourselves differently than we did at one time. And one of the things that he's already expressed his own anxieties about his own supposed rewiring that he's undergone is a change from a certain type of reading activity that he no longer finds as easy to do as he once did. And so his chapter on print is interesting and is reminiscent of ideas both in Postman and McLuhan. This idea of deep reading, and a very interesting, but I would have to say historically, maybe not a completely accurate account of the emergent phenomenon of silent reading in the Middle Ages, supposedly. I've done a little bit of Googling on this, read a few things that call the thesis into question. The basic idea is that because of some changes in book production and the way that books were actually made, that really people actually reading to themselves silently, as opposed to reading aloud, was something that really didn't happen in the ancient world, and that really only began to happen in the Middle Ages, and really in the late Middle Ages, and that this silent reading, this deep silent reading, encouraged a certain type of mindset and perhaps a certain type of wiring, let's say, patterning of our neurons, which is a very deep and large thesis that would take a lot of scrutiny on the part of neuroscientists and philosophers and linguists. And Carr is none of those things. He's a journalist, but they're speculative ideas, but they're interesting. But his thesis is this: about deep reading, which is silent reading. The development of knowledge became an increasingly private act, with each reader creating in his own mind a personal synthesis of the ideas and information passed down through the writings of other thinkers. The sense of individualism strengthened. And the type of reading activity is that one where the reader becomes the book. He quotes a poem by Wallace Stevens about the act of reading and about the kind of immersion, the kind of silence and forgetfulness of self that we can experience in reading, which is, of course, what he thinks is being lost, what Carr thinks is being lost as we transition, just as Postman thought tragically that we were losing something of the same thing in the flowering of television culture. But what connects Carr's thesis, of course, with McLuhan is the sense of individualism. I think that this is pretty consistent with McLuhan's ideas that the electronic age, the age of electric media, was breaking down our sense of individualism. and that individualism was bound up with a print culture, a reading culture, and now that it's being supplanted by something else, McLuhan says that sort of historically achieved sense of individualism, the human individual, was changing, morphing into something else as a result of its contact with electric media. So yes, I mean, and he is talking about previous revolutions, media revolutions, just as Postman and McLuhan did, and I thought that was quite interesting. You know, his brief description of Gutenberg and the Gutenberg age, and just how much of a shock to the existing European culture it must have been when all of a sudden there were books, affordable books. Although that was a continuing story, right? Books were still quite expensive well into the 20th century, until the development of the cheap paperback, especially by Penguin, the great British publisher, but also many American publishers, where literature, serious books were now available to us, the common people, at affordable prices. But it couldn't compare to the shock of going from a world in which books were quite expensive and were written by hand and were owned by monasteries, and a few libraries, and rich people, to a world in which books were everywhere. And so that was a huge change. I'm sure very comparable to the change that McLuhan thought happened in the 20th century with radio and television, where all of a sudden everybody knew about things. Everybody had access to information. Everybody had access to different forms of drama and entertainment, and a window in the world that just simply didn't exist for the average person. It was really the province of elites. So also very, very, very important thing. And again, reminiscent of Postman, this quote from the scientist J.Z. Young about what the changes were that sort of helped to make the modern age, where a different way of seeing the world became dominant, where books became, this is reminiscent of Postman's idea of epistemologies changing, our definition of truth, or what constitutes truth, or where truth comes from. It's no longer, as Young says, a matter of fitting sensory experience with the symbols of religion. But now that we have books where people can actually write, we have access to people's expository writing, to their arguments, to their observations, that it encourages a more critical outlook, where we don't have the sort of archetypes that we use to sort of fit our experience or make our experience fit to it. We have a more dialogical way of thinking about the world. I think Carr takes this about as far as you can go in terms of making claims that this print revolution, the Gutenberg revolution, produced a different sort of human being, not just a certain type of reader, but someone whose reading experience was then carried over to the rest of his or her life. He says one of the most important lessons we've learned from the study of neuroplasticity is that mental capacities, the very neural circuits we develop for one purpose, let's say for the purpose of sustained silent reading, can be put to other uses as well. As our ancestors imbued their minds with the discipline to follow a line of argument or narrative through a succession of printed pages, they became more contemplative, reflective, and imaginative. So this is a very large thesis. Again, very speculative, would take a lot of careful thought to determine whether it's a sound thesis. But the idea is that the habits of thought that were developed as a result of the reading experience were carried over and to our whole way of looking at the world, and that we became more critical, as he says, more contemplative, reflective, and imaginative, and even had a hand in the development of the scientific revolution and the development of American, European, and now world culture, sort of flowering as a result of the new attitudes that were engendered by the experience of this sort of individualistic reading, this highly immersive and deep reading. Well, and then we sort of come to the end, and really this is the purpose of what he's doing, is to argue that we are coming to a certain new type of thinking. The world of the screen, he says, is a very different place from the world of the page. A new intellectual ethic is taking hold. And if we back up to what he means by intellectual ethic, I know I got something on it. I want to find it because right here. This is right out of Postman, right? The idea of an intellectual ethic is, I find, very similar to Postman's idea of a medium's bias. That is, that we'll remember that Postman argued that television has a different set of biases than the printed page. That is, that television his biases were towards entertainment rather than critical thought. Whereas printed word, its biases were towards logic, exposition, and reason. Very similar to what Carr is calling an intellectual ethic. He says every intellectual technology embodies an intellectual ethic, set of assumptions about how the human mind works or should work. Again, so if we skip to the end, we could see that yes, he is claiming that a new intellectual ethic is taking hold. As he says, the pathways in our brain are once again being rerouted. Again, grounding this, or attempting to ground this thesis in biology, in neuroscience, actually, which again, you take it for what it's worth. I mean, you decide whether you're convinced by it. So I suppose then we have to find out, I mean, what is Carr saying about this new world, this new intellectual ethic? In what ways is it different from the old world of deep reading? What sort of changes are happening? And we'll see